On reflecting on my exposure to biographies, it doesn't seem like life is predisposed to be painless, graceful, or conflict-free. I'm listening to the biographies, and just as an aside, I mean, this may not seem, like something surprising, but having lived a somewhat isolated life, number one. Number two, having a dominant influence in the form of the channel Lazaris and listening to thousands of hours of kind of excessively optimistic, promises and descriptions of reality, where life gets better and better, and, then going on to Napoleon Hill and W. Clement Stone and, things like success with a positive mental attitude. There certainly has been a premise in much of my life that if I live my life, quote, appropriately or spiritually or, metaphysically, that, my life will be, an ascending path of greater and greater ease, success, joy, love, and well-being. And although, my life has had, a little bit of a bell-shaped curve around that, with, I would say, my well-being and grace peaking, I don't know, somewhere around age 31 to 33, somewhere in there, followed by a descent. So we had the misery and trauma of childhood, the appeasement and coping of adolescent and young adulthood, followed by the ascent from roughly age 26, up to age 33, and then a descent. Descent in energy, increase in stress, increase in grief, increase in trauma, increase in frustration, increase in addiction, increase in isolation. And so there may be another wave, coming, but it certainly hasn't been, a steady ascent. So that's, one data point. And in this downward movement, the works of Robert Bly, Marion Woodman, Alice Miller, Gabor Mate, have been part of acknowledging the downward descent into what could arguably be called, more loneliness, more grief, more pain, than before, right? So this is, has been and is quite a low trough. But, how personal is that particular pattern in life relative to the world, relative to other people? And, that may be something that is a matter of focus, but the statistics do not seem, to be particularly good, at, affirming the Lazaris template of reality. And so, this is what I'm reflecting on right now. I'm listening to Walter Isaacson's biography on Benjamin Franklin, having already completed the biography of Elon Musk, and then Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. And so, some of those are forefront in my mind, although I have been, some of my first biographies were John D. Rockefeller Sr., I think most of the great financiers, Andrew Carnegie, directly and indirectly, accessed through Napoleon Hill. Anyway, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs' earlier biographies, in my teenage years. So, and then where I think more mindful of larger stage politicians or presidents. I would say that, politics seems like a pretty miserable life. If I look at Mitt Romney, his wife getting cancer just as he's kind of aiming to be president, not being president precisely because of doing what he believes in, watching his party implode around him, with the goal of winning as it switched from its values to Trump, watching the mediocrity, the misery of Trump in his life, from his childhood abuse to kind of constant indebtedness and, vindictive nature. Things not going very well for him at the moment. If I look at Franklin's life, what I see is some early childhood tensions, some of his siblings dying, in early childbirth, being sent away to a somewhat punitive uncle to learn printing, being beaten, being humiliated, not being paid very well, and, having a 9-year apprenticeship for just learning to print things, not so great. So then there's the capitalism or elitism of the British relative to Americans, of the wealthy relative to the working class. Pretty miserable thing to live in and under. Then there's the chauvinism. Then there's the fact that, if I look at all the conflicts in Benjamin's life, just a stunning amount. So he has a fight with his uncle and doesn't complete his apprenticeship, right? So that's one of the first relationships he's got. While being an apprentice, he has fights with the authorities, and his uncle is thrown in prison for political satire, right? So not a very nice thing to do, to block freedom of speech. And he can't get capital, from his father or other people. There's a governor that when he runs away, he ingratiates himself with, people in another state, because if you leave an apprenticeship, you're basically written off within that whole town. So he's kind of left between being beaten and publicly humiliated or written off after years of apprenticeship, right? And still supposedly can't run a printer when he obviously can. So there's some of that top-down energy that's not very intelligent or fair. Then a governor promises to fund him, and if he opens up a print shop in that area, and the governor lies to him 10 or 20 times that he's going to fund him and write the letters. So Franklin goes off to England to buy the printing equipment to come back and be a printer, only to find when he arrives in England that the governor did not give the letters of recommendation or the money. And so he can't come back, right? And so there's a rift there and a betrayal. Then he has two male friends, both of which borrow money from him, lie and cheat him, and then blame him for it, right? Not a very nice experience. Meanwhile, he wanted to marry a young woman in the US, and the mother wouldn't let them marry until he proved that he had lots of money. So the marriage was delayed, right? Because the girl listens to the mother. And so basically, if you don't have enough money to pay for my daughter, you can't marry her. Then he has another fight with another woman who he wants to give him a dowry, but they refuse the dowry, and so they get in a big fight. Meanwhile, when he loses all the money from the promised governorship, like who never funded the equipment, when he's over in England, he realizes he doesn't even have the money to go back. He becomes then an apprentice in England, and the colleagues have a drinking fund. So he's working as a printer there as a new apprentice, which has got to be disappointing, right? Because you didn't finish the first apprenticeship, then you have to start all over. Then he's stiffed by the governor. So, but he's asked to contribute money to the drinking fund, but he says he doesn't drink alcohol, doesn't want to drink alcohol, so he's not going to contribute to the drinking fund so that everyone else can drink alcohol with his money. So all his colleagues humiliate and play jokes on him until he realizes that even though he doesn't drink alcohol and doesn't want to drink, if he wants to have peace at work, he's going to have to, relent and give his money away so that his colleagues can drink more alcohol. So he does that. And then he is accepted. But what a shitty bunch of colleagues. Like, I don't want colleagues like that for my benefit, coerce me into paying for their things and punish me if I don't go along with it. So pretty shitty. Then, having realized that he's not coming back in the US, he decides to cavort with prostitutes and just dismiss his fiancée in the US. So, first the mother dismisses him because he doesn't have enough money. He promises to go over to England and then hurry back with the printing equipment, and then they'll get married. But when he realizes he doesn't have the money, he just writes a dismissive letter to the girl, blows her off, and starts to cavort with prostitutes. He's also an incredible hypocrite in terms, Franklin is known for inventing platitudes, and he's constantly making up platitudes, many of which are popular today. But as a printer and as a private person, meaning in, behind the scenes, he does two things. He puts forth one view, his platitudes are kind of his public face, but then his shadow thoughts and feelings are expressed through his printer as supposed letters to the editor, right? So basically, anytime he has a shadow agenda, he pretends that some peasant or some worker or some nobleman or something is writing to him and puts all of his thoughts and opinions into their letter, and then has it both ways. So he writes, his platitudes, and then he writes whatever he wants as someone to his own paper, right? So that's what he does there. He also publishes anonymous pamphlets which say the opposite. And then he defends himself based on what he said in his platitudes, rather than what he's saying through the letters he's actually writing, pretending to be someone else. And the hypocrisy, I think the epitome of the hypocrisy that I've seen in that is he publicly does not criticize his competitor, the publisher. Right? He publicly doesn't criticize his competitor as him. The competitor does criticize Franklin for his foul play, right? So when Franklin plays foul, the other competitor publicly criticizes Franklin. Now, Franklin does not publicly, as himself, criticize the other printer. What he does is he writes a series of letters that he writes, pretending to be someone else, in which those people supposedly publish his competitor. And the people who he's pretending to be say things like, isn't it scandalous that this other competitor, slanders the Ben Franklin, when Ben Franklin refuses to slander them, right? So pretending to be someone else, he's praising himself while slandering the other person, and he's saying that he is more virtuous because he's not slandering them, but he's just doing it dishonestly. He's going about it covertly and slandering the other person, pretending to be someone else so that he can look more virtuous. Right? And so regardless of what it is, he has an illegitimate son with a prostitute and then he kind of keeps that relationship, keeps the mother in the dark, doesn't say who the mother is, etc. So that's not really that great for the boy, but, that's partly to protect his own reputation. And anyway, so he writes off, the first woman. Then when he comes back with, more money later to the U.S., he gets engaged with someone who he wants to give him a dowry that would pay off all his business debts. When the family refuses to pay him a large dowry, of some tens of thousands of dollars, he breaks off the relationship, which means that, just as that woman wouldn't let him marry her daughter except for money, he won't marry the woman he says he loves and wants to settle down with because her family won't pay enough money, which is, pretty disgusting. I found that pretty disgusting when a woman that wanted to marry me then wanted me to pay her Thai family $30,000 as a dowry and wouldn't go. It just seemed really disgusting, that whole thing seemed disgusting to me, to kind of have money be a condition of marriage. Franklin has advertised slaves for sale and complained that slaves aren't profitable enough, right? So again, so he's got slaves, his grandmother's got slaves. I think one of his relatives had to buy a slave that he fell in love with, buy the slave so that she could be a free person and get married. Not an easy thing for the slave or the slave, owners. Then, before Franklin got into business for himself, his boss tried to get Franklin to train lower paid employees so that he could kick Franklin out. Right? So Franklin had the skill, and the boss didn't want to pay Franklin a higher salary. So he tried to get Franklin to train those people and then get rid of Franklin. And instead, Franklin saw what he was up to and made a deal with one of the more skilled employees, and they left to start a competitive printing thing. Right? So the one he was tried to be somewhat betrayed or, treated poorly, and then he treated his boss poorly. That's no fun. And his life just goes on like that. We're just getting started, and it's his one great relationship seems to be with his wife, but they didn't see each other for 15 years while he's out traveling because she doesn't feel like traveling. So, what kind of marriage is that if you're separate for 15 years, but just, write some letters back and forth because she doesn't like traveling and he needs to go and do his ambassadorships and all that. There's plenty of interesting highlights, but just look at the amount of conflict just to get to age 30. Right? Jilted love, betrayals, whippings, humiliations, oppressive this, oppressive that, being, looking down on slaves, buying people, selling people, dealing with the British aristocracy, being thrown in jail for free speech. It's just an endless series of frustrations, humiliations, unfairnesses, etc. And he's considered a great person with a great life, right? So, is that the definition of a well-lived life? To have to watch your back at every turn. Now, it's not much different for Elon Musk. Bullied at school, shamed and tormented by his father, divorce, horrible military schools, where it's kind of survival of the fittest. Death of one of his kids, problem with this romantic relationship, problem with another romantic relationship, having people trying to seize his companies as he tries to do a good job, working 100-hour weeks. It's not, as Elon says, it's not that much fun to be me. It looks fun on the outside, but it's pretty miserable in many ways. Now, Steve Jobs, it's a very different biography, but he's highly cruel and sociopathic to his first girlfriend. He's somewhat sadistic and sociopathic towards his adoptive parents. And he also feels unlovable and abandoned in some way. He's somewhat exploitive of Wozniak. He's not a very happy man, for sure. Plenty of unhappiness, plenty of arrogance, plenty of cruelty, plenty of hard work, again, getting cancer, public humiliation. There's not any of these lives that I look at and think, well, I wish I was that person, or I wish I'd lived that life. I look at my own life and the amount of pain and misery in it, and I feel like my pain and misery would be much higher in those other lives, but I don't like the pain and misery in my own life. Rockefeller Sr., pretty miserable life in many ways. Yeah, I'm. There's no U.S. president that I think I would have enjoyed being them. My wife has had a pretty miserable life, and so what I'm. Yeah, so I'm not seeing any of this kind of real ascent. I think that some people are much better at putting on performances about how great things are. But I believe the performance less and less. And what I'm wondering is if the sphere is not the best model of life. And what I mean by that is that, the color wheel, right? The color wheel has every possible color, but a refracted color wheel does not predominate. Like there's not more red than there is black, than there is green, there's not more light colors than dark colors, there's not more green than there is blue or yellow, right? There's a symmetry to the possibility field. The possibility field is neutral, it goes out in all directions. Whatever we consider positive, whatever we consider negative is the possibility field. And the color possibility field is neutral, right? It has every shade of possible color. The direction possibility field is, of course, going out in all directions equally. So what if the possibility field is neutral and the probability field is neutral and the actual field is neutral? Meaning that whatever we consider up, there's as much up as there is down over time. Now, I'm more in favor of believing in many lives than I am singular life or reincarnation, and possibly all different probable lives going on at the same time, in infinite probabilities. And so it seems to me that to the degree that I'm attached to something, care about something, love something, is to the degree to which I'm angry and upset and hurt and betrayed when it's violated. And to the degree that I don't care about things, my life is less meaningful, but I also don't feel as upset when it's violated. So there seem to be all these things in going out in multiple directions, right? That with one thing comes the other thing, right? That with ecstatic joy comes attachment, comes grief, right? Things that type of thing. Now, I haven't thought it through in every situation. And I certainly meet people who appear to be far more upward than downward over time. But certainly whether it's Christ or Buddha or Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa has lived a horrible, lonely life with pain and suffering. Christ, horrible, miserable life with pain and suffering. Gandhi, horrible, miserable life with pain and suffering. And so the up certainly seems to be balanced with the down. And I think it seems particularly the case that people that bring great change have great sacrifice. You know, it's they pay a price to bring great change. And so that's kind of my working mulling theory at the moment, that that there's a cost for everything, that there's a counterpoint to everything, and that there is no life that goes up without going down. There's no life that goes down without going up. You know, there are some asymmetrical lives that, you know, just stay down and are miserable for the whole lifetime. But if we look at then the larger fabric of time and the larger fabric of probability, right, then there's also going to be some lives that go up more without coming down in that life, that are more charmed in a certain way in that life. You know, but having experienced a fair degree of pleasure, hedonic adaptation just kicks in, you know. So what do you do when you're already eating the best food in the world every day in a beautiful place without variation? You know, it just gets boring, right? And so even that, right? And that's, I think, in some ways the worst place to be, and I've certainly been there, where I'm irritable, bored, and frustrated, but I'm already eating the best thing I can imagine eating. I'm in the best place I can imagine and know where to be, you know, and it's just too good and too boring, right? Right. So that's its own kind of hell. So it seems symmetrical in over time and in some way. In which case a full life will be to traverse the full spectrum of success and failure, joy and despair, hope and hopelessness, caring and apathy, boredom and total engagement, peace and war, you know, just through basically that's life, that's the possibility field, and that a rich life means to traverse all of those states with a certain amount of grace, with a certain amount of acceptance, that that's part of being part of the possibility field, the probability field, and the actual field. And to have some humor, have some grace, have some preparation, right? Have some preparation and kind of move towards moderating the extremes, right? So that it doesn't have to be billions or extreme poverty, but, you know, more in the middle. But not too much in the middle that it gets boring and, you know, we go numb. So that, as far as I can see, the truest thing is the sphere. And the sphere contains the full cycle of colors, the full cycle of feelings, the full cycle of possibilities, probabilities, and actualities. And we learn and grow and become more as we traverse each one and accept them as part of who we are and part of life.